The day Seraphina Kingsley placed a contract worth $66,000 a month in front of Grant Holloway, every person in that boardroom assumed the single father would sign before the ink dried. He owed 3 months of rent. His repair shop was days from closing, and his daughter had just opened her tuition notice for the coming semester. But Grant turned to the final clause, where the rescue technology he and his late wife had spent a decade building together would become the permanent property of Kingsley Dynamics. He remembered what Elise had told him before she died. Do not let them turn the right to be saved into something people have to purchase. Grant slid the pen back across the table. Seraphina smiled coolly. You'll regret this. Stay until the end to find out which promise matters more than $66,000 a month and a billion-dollar empire. Kingsley Dynamics had spent 3 years and several $100 million developing CrownShield, a smart emergency coordination network that company materials described as capable of managing the safe evacuation of millions of people through fires, earthquakes, power failures, and any major infrastructure event a modern city could produce. What those materials did not disclose was that CrownShield rested almost entirely on the engineering framework of Lifeline Grid, a system that Grant Holloway and his late wife Elise had developed a decade earlier at a small Seattle firm, before a cascade of debt and illness had forced them to sell the majority of their intellectual property at a fraction of what it was worth. Kingsley's engineers had spent years attempting to activate the system's central coordination layer, the component that separated an expensive sensor network from a genuine life-saving architecture, and had never succeeded because that layer required an authentication key called Equal Light Root that Grant had never surrendered as part of any sale. He kept it on a drive worn close to his chest every day since Elise died, not as leverage against anyone, but because she had asked him to protect it, and he could not set that request aside. Seraphina Kingsley sent a car for Grant on a gray Tuesday morning, and he arrived at the tower in the kind of clothes that announced exactly what he was: work boots, a canvas jacket worn soft at the elbows, hands that carried the permanent evidence of solder and machine oil regardless of how long he scrubbed them. The boardroom occupied the 43rd floor, with a view of the Sound that Grant had not seen since the early years of his marriage, and the executives seated around its table were the kind of people who had never personally experienced 3 months of overdue rent or a notice from a bank losing patience. Seraphina presented the offer directly and without theater, the way a person did when they had already determined which numbers would carry the most weight. $66,000 per month, an 18-month contract, full housing, a vehicle, comprehensive benefits, a $1 million performance bonus contingent on CrownShield clearing federal safety testing, and a separate provision covering every remaining semester of Willa's university tuition, which Seraphina mentioned last because she knew it was the most effective argument in the room. Every person present expected Grant to reach for the pen before she finished that sentence. He did not reach for the pen. He turned past the compensation schedule, past the technical timeline, past the pages of confidentiality language, until he found the addenda at the back, printed in a type size slightly smaller than the rest, positioned between 2 longer exhibits in the way that a fatigued or financially desperate person reading quickly might reasonably miss. The addenda granted Kingsley Dynamics permanent ownership over all code Grant produced during the contract period, removed every public access protection Elise had written into the system's original architecture, authorized the sale of emergency response services across a tiered payment structure, required all algorithmic logic to remain confidential from regulatory agencies, and transferred Grant's authentication key into Kingsley's full and unrestricted control without any future requirement for his consent. He set down the contract and looked at Seraphina and asked her one question. In an active fire inside a building running CrownShield, would a maintenance worker in the service corridor receive an evacuation alert at the same moment as a premium subscriber in the executive suites? Seraphina answered without hesitation that resource prioritization was a standard feature of commercial infrastructure design, that Kingsley optimized outcomes within the parameters clients selected, and that the company was not in the business of making individual determinations about who survived any particular emergency event. Grant acknowledged the answer, closed the contract, placed the pen on top of it, and slid both back toward the center of the table. Dorian Blackthorne, seated at Seraphina's right hand, did not speak. He simply watched Grant with the stillness of a man who had anticipated this exact outcome and had already moved on to what came next. Seraphina informed Grant that Kingsley would activate CrownShield through alternative engineering approaches and strongly encouraged him to reconsider while the offer remained open. Grant thanked her for her time, declined the car, and walked 6 blocks to the bus stop in the November rain without once looking back at the building behind him. The shop Grant returned to was a converted warehouse on the south end of the city that smelled of solder flux and machine oil, and the particular kind of quiet that comes from years of working alone on things that had to function correctly when someone's life depended on them. He had kept it operating for 11 years through municipal contracts and word-of-mouth referrals from fire stations and volunteer rescue teams, and the work had never made him wealthy, but Elise had always argued that the absence of shame was the harder achievement and the more honest measure of a business. The envelope from the landlord was on top of his keyboard when he got back. 3 months of commercial rent, stated plainly, with no softening language. And the voicemail from the bank was equally clear about what would happen to the house if the account situation did not change within 60 days. He sat at the bench and began resoldering a relay module for a rescue crew 2 miles away, and did not let himself run the arithmetic that had been waiting for him since the 43rd floor. Willa arrived that evening without calling ahead, which told Grant she already knew. The same way, she always seemed to know the things he had not yet decided how to say. She was 19 years old and studying industrial design with a focus and precision that were entirely her mother's, and she had her mother's particular habit of sitting with something in complete silence before she said a word about it. She did not tell him he was wrong. She asked a question that stayed with him long after she drove home: whether there was a version of the arrangement in which he took the position, kept the key, and worked to change the system from inside a structure that actually had the resources to sustain it, rather than from a shop that was running out of room to breathe. Grant told her the story he had never told in full. Many years earlier, Elise had been engaged as a behavioral consultant after a shopping center fire that resulted in 14 injuries, most of them among the service employees who worked in the building's rear sections. The investigation found that the facility's emergency system had been configured to prioritize the commercial floors occupied by premium tenants, directing alerts and unlocking exits in order of revenue value, so that the people cleaning and stocking and maintaining the building received warnings several critical minutes after the people shopping inside it. Elise had come home from that work, changed in a way Grant recognized immediately, more careful, more deliberate, already designing something in her head, and within 6 months, the two of them had begun building Lifeline Grid on a single conviction. An emergency system organized around financial standing was not an emergency system. It was a liability calculation with better sensors. They had written 3 operating principles into the architecture, not as documentation, but as functional constraints embedded in the code itself. No distinction by status or capacity to pay. Unconditional free access for all public emergency services, and no individual or corporation permitted to secretly alter the sequence in which people received help. Elise had insisted on the word secretly because she had lived long enough to see companies use the gap between a published policy and a hidden algorithm to insulate themselves from accountability, and she had understood that a principle without an enforcement mechanism was just an opinion. In the months before she died, she had asked Grant to make a specific promise. Not that he would prevent the system from ever operating commercially, but that he would destroy it before allowing anyone to convert it into a mechanism for deciding whose survival was most financially justified. Grant had not refused Seraphina's contract because he was sentimental or irrational or unable to acknowledge that Willa's tuition was real and the bank's letters were going to keep arriving. He had refused because every clause of that addenda had violated all 3 of Elise's principles simultaneously, in writing, with full legal authority behind it. While Grant sat at his bench that night, Dorian Blackthorne was in the Kingsley server room overseeing the activation of a backup development build that carried Grant's name in its version metadata from an earlier collaboration, instructing the team to proceed despite Adrian Cole's explicit warning that the build had not completed stability certification and was not ready for any environment beyond controlled testing. The system came alive on the monitors, and among its first outputs was a message no current team member had written, a line Elise had embedded so deep in the original architecture that it had survived every subsequent modification. If this system requires a price to be placed on a life, it is no longer a rescue system. Dorian read it once, told the technician beside him to remove it from the startup sequence, and continued. Kingsley staged the CrownShield demonstration at an underground transit testing facility built for exactly this kind of showcase. 3 levels of corridors and platforms instrumented with hundreds of sensors, emergency exits, elevators, ventilation controls, and directional panels, all connected to the CrownShield network and monitored from a surface operations room with a glass wall facing the main display. The guest list included federal transportation officials, municipal emergency directors, investors from 4 major infrastructure funds, and journalists who had been briefed extensively on the scale of what was at stake. Deployment across 70 major transit hubs nationwide, a project that Kingsley's communications team was publicly calling the largest emergency safety infrastructure upgrade in a generation. Seraphina delivered the opening address with the precision of someone who had spent 3 years working toward a single afternoon, and Adrian managed the technical briefing with a competence that masked the uncertainty he had been carrying since Dorian had overruled his objections about the build's readiness. The test scenario involved a simulated fire across 3 floor levels simultaneously, requiring CrownShield to manage evacuation routing, power distribution, elevator allocation, and alert sequencing for several hundred population data points distributed throughout the facility. For the first 11 minutes, the system performed in a way that made investors reach for their phones to update their models. Exits unlocking in correct sequence, directional displays refreshing in real time, emergency power routing cleanly to the right systems, The kind of demonstration that made every commitment Kingsley had made to the government appear not just achievable, but inevitable. Then the simulation scaled upward in population density, and the priority ledger's allocation logic encountered a condition it had been designed to handle, but that Dorian had not anticipated surfacing during a controlled test. Half the emergency exits locked, backup power shifted entirely to the premium corridor and upper concourse. The elevator system entered priority hold for the executive access zones, and in the maintenance and service areas, the very sections Elise had engineered equal light route specifically to protect. The emergency alert sequence slowed to a fraction of its normal operational speed, because the system had calculated that the legal and financial exposure to Kingsley from delayed warnings in those zones fell within an acceptable threshold. Adrian attempted a manual override from the operations console and found that the manual control protocols had been disabled before the demonstration began, locked at a clearance level above his own, and that he was watching the test produce exactly what Dorian's modifications had been built to produce, just not in a context that anyone could explain to a room full of federal officials. Grant had been watching the demonstrations live stream from his shop through a broadcast link a contact at one of his client fire stations had sent over, and he identified the priority ledger's load signature within 4 minutes of the failure beginning. A distinctive pattern in the power allocation cycle that he recognized from architecture documents he had reviewed during an earlier and unsuccessful acquisition approach by Dorian's intermediaries. He called Seraphina's direct line 3 times. Each time, the call was logged as a vendor inquiry and not connected. He sent Adrian a message through a technical engineering forum they had both used years earlier, attaching a sequence of 12 characters, an emergency reset command buried so deep in the original codebase that it bypassed every layer installed on top and forced the entire system back into equal light configuration. Adrian stared at it for 3 seconds, then typed it into the terminal. The exits unlocked, the lights restored, the alert sequencing normalized across every section of the facility without distinction or hierarchy. The demonstration concluded in a controlled shutdown that the Kingsley operations team immediately characterized to the assembled guests as a minor calibration resolution managed by the engineering staff on site, and Dorian personally assured the investors that the interruption had been an expected stress test variable that had demonstrated the system's capacity for self-correction. Seraphina stood at the edge of the operations room and said very little to anyone. No calibration error produced the load signature she had watched on the monitor. No override locked from inside the facility explained itself cleanly, and no one on her team could account for why a reset command at the most critical moment had originated from a source entirely outside the Kingsley network. She pulled the original acquisition file for the address of Grant's shop and drove there herself that same evening, offering him the position again with the same salary and the same addenda unchanged. Grant refused a second time and told her she did not need him to repair the system. She needed him to help her stop the system from pushing back against what was wrong with it. Dorian filed a formal complaint with the legal department that night, identifying the reset command as deliberate sabotage bearing Grant Holloway's unmistakable technical signature. Kingsley Dynamics filed the lawsuit on a Friday morning, and by noon the filing had been summarized across every major business publication in language that Dorian's communications team had drafted in advance. The allegations were comprehensive: unauthorized access to a proprietary emergency system, deliberate interference with a federal safety demonstration, retention of authentication credentials for financial coercion, intellectual property violations affecting technology valued at several $100 million, and commercial damages qualifying the case for emergency injunctive relief. Dorian had also arranged, through intermediaries whose connection to Kingsley was not immediately visible, for the details of Grant's personal financial situation to reach a handful of business reporters before the filing appeared: the overdue rent, the canceled contracts, the bank's correspondence, framed in a narrative presenting a desperate man who had engineered a public crisis to demonstrate his own indispensability and force a company to meet his financial demands. The response was swift. 3 of Grant's municipal repair contracts were suspended pending review of the allegations. The bank received a copy of the lawsuit from an anonymous source and moved his account to accelerated collection. 2 fire stations quietly paused their standing orders while their legal departments assessed the situation. Willa called and was quiet for a long time before asking if there was anything she could do, and Grant told her what he had been telling himself since the filing appeared: that the facts would eventually become clear, which he believed, because it was the only thing left that still held any structure. Camille Davenport had served as Kingsley's chief legal counsel for 9 years, which was long enough to understand the difference between a lawsuit filed to pursue justice and a lawsuit filed to produce a specific outcome through applied pressure. She reviewed the complaint the same day it was filed, not from doubt, but from professional obligation, to understand everything she was putting her name to. The first anomaly she found was that the 12-character reset command, which formed the centerpiece of the sabotage allegation, had entered the system approximately 4 minutes after the priority ledger had already locked the emergency exits and rerouted the power. In legal terms, that sequencing eliminated the causal argument entirely, because, whatever Grant had done, the dangerous failure had preceded it, and his intervention had ended it. The complaint had been structured in a way that omitted this timeline. The second anomaly was more significant. Tracing the lawsuit's preparation through the document management system, Camille found that the complaint had been drafted, reviewed, and formatted for filing 14 days before the demonstration took place, which was also 14 days before Grant had officially declined the contract, and several days before the first meeting between Grant and Seraphina had even been scheduled. Adrian Cole spent 3 days conducting a private technical audit of the priority ledger code he had been permitted to access, and what he found extended well beyond the executive tier prioritization that Seraphina had described to him as standard resource allocation. The system had been designed to rank individuals according to 5 weighted variables: organizational title, insurance tier, financial value to the client entity, estimated legal risk to Kingsley if that person were harmed, and a composite derived from the previous 4, which meant that a maintenance worker with no insurance coverage, no corporate affiliation, and no capacity to initiate litigation would consistently receive the lowest priority rating across every emergency scenario the system was asked to model. The algorithm was not malfunctioning. It was performing precisely as designed, and its designer had never asked Seraphina to review or approve it. Seraphina read Adrian's report with the door closed and sat without moving for a long time when she finished. She contacted Camille and asked her to pause further action on the lawsuit. Dorian learned of this within the hour and convened an emergency meeting of the board's senior advisory committee, presenting Seraphina's instruction as evidence that personal sentiment was compromising her judgment on the most commercially significant contract in the company's history. The board gave her 48 hours to authorize full CrownShield activation or face a formal motion to suspend her executive authority. Grant had kept the box on the top shelf of the bedroom closet for 4 years, close enough to reach without effort and far enough that he did not encounter it accidentally when he was not prepared. Elise had placed it in his hands in the final weeks and told him what was inside and made him promise not to open it until he was standing in front of a choice he could not make without understanding something she had not been able to tell him while she was alive. He had honored that condition longer than he had expected to, partly from grief and partly from the knowledge that opening it would be the last new thing she ever said to him. The box contained a data drive, a physical backup copy of Equal Light Route, and a recording on a small device that Elise had filmed in the sitting room 8 months before she died, on a morning when she was having a good day. She looked like herself in the recording, direct, precise, wearing the particular expression she used when she was explaining something she had thought through very carefully and did not want misunderstood. She told him what she had discovered before her illness had progressed past the point where she could still conduct the kind of investigation it required. Years before Kingsley Dynamics had been part of any conversation about Lifeline Grid, Dorian Blackthorne had approached their startup through a sequence of intermediary investment funds, each removed enough from the next that the connection to him was not immediately traceable. He had offered to acquire the company under terms that included the addition of a client classification layer, a mechanism for sorting users by financial value and adjusting the system's responses accordingly. Elise had refused. Within months of her diagnosis, Dorian had begun acquiring the company's outstanding debt through the same intermediary network, and when the medical costs and the company's overextension had made the financial pressure unsustainable, Grant had sold the core platform code to a holding entity that Dorian controlled without ever knowing who stood at the center of the arrangement. The sale had transferred rights to the foundational codebase, which was the version Kingsley was now operating. But the sale agreement had been drafted narrowly, because the attorney Elise had retained in those final months had understood something Dorian's intermediaries had not anticipated. Equal Light Route and the ethical constraint architecture surrounding it had never been formally included in the company's asset register. Because Elise had transferred those components 6 months earlier into a public benefit trust she had established for precisely that purpose. Grant held full legal authority over the trust's assets. Dorian had never owned Equal Light Route. The entire structure of the contract offer, the salary, the addenda, the permanent control clause, the key transfer provision, had not been an employment arrangement. It had been a legal mechanism to obtain Grant's signature on a document that would give Dorian what 4 years of corporate maneuvering had failed to produce through any other means. The final portion of Elise's recording said, "I am not asking you to live poorly to prove you are a good person. I am not asking you to refuse every commercial arrangement or stay angry at everyone who values money. I am asking you not to sell the authority to decide whose life is saved first, because once that authority is sold, no amount of regret purchases it back." Grant sat on the edge of the bed for a long time when the recording ended. He understood now that the promise was not a demand to remain stationary or grieving or permanently opposed to Seraphina's company. The promise meant that he could cooperate with anyone, under any financial terms, as long as the mechanism determining who received help first was protected by law, rather than by the goodwill of an executive who could be overruled by a board at any moment. He drafted the terms of a new arrangement that night. Kingsley could manufacture and maintain the system commercially. All public emergency services would receive full platform access at no cost. Priority ledger would be deleted entirely. The allocation code would be subject to independent auditing, and a public benefit board would hold authority to suspend the system if any of those conditions were violated. Grant would not transfer the original key permanently under any circumstances. Seraphina wanted to accept. The board refused to authorize it. And while those negotiations continued, Dorian had already located and copied the drive's contents and was preparing to activate CrownShield in a live setting because a storm of unusual severity was moving into the Seattle area, and one of the transit hubs enrolled in the pilot program was directly in its path. The storm arrived in the early evening with rainfall and sustained winds that overwhelmed the drainage systems in 3 city districts within the first hour. Water began moving into the lower levels of the Meridian Transit Center, an underground hub enrolled in the CrownShield pilot program 6 weeks earlier on Dorian's authorization, without the independent safety assessment Seraphina had listed as a prerequisite in the project's planning documents. Approximately 600 people were inside. Evening commuters, a transit authority maintenance crew completing a scheduled repair in the lower concourse, and the overnight cleaning staff who had arrived early because of the weather forecast. None of them had been informed that the building's emergency systems had been transferred to an experimental platform that had not completed full certification testing. Dorian presented the situation to the board's senior committee as an opportunity. A live deployment under real-world conditions with government officials and press already tracking the storm coverage. A demonstration of CrownShield's operational readiness in front of exactly the audience that mattered most. Seraphina told the committee that Priority Ledger was still embedded in the active build, that the system would not respond correctly under genuine emergency conditions, and that activating CrownShield in those circumstances with those people inside was not a demonstration. It was an experiment conducted without consent on 600 human beings. The committee voted to proceed, transferred emergency operational authority to Dorian, and suspended Seraphina's executive powers for the duration of the crisis. CrownShield activated at 9:42 in the evening. The system's response was immediate, comprehensive, and catastrophically organized around the priority ledger's hierarchy. Backup generators shifted output to the premium passenger waiting areas on the main concourse. The elevator system entered priority hold for the administrative and official access zones. 3 emergency exits leading from the maintenance levels locked as the system classified those sections as low legal risk areas, and the emergency alert speed in those sections dropped to a fraction of normal because the financial and legal exposure to Kingsley from delayed warnings there had been assessed as within an acceptable threshold. Adrian entered the operations center and attempted a manual override. His credentials had been suspended as part of the board's emergency authorization package, which Dorian had prepared before the storm reached the city. Seraphina left the Kingsley building through a service exit and drove to Grant's shop without calling ahead. She walked in on him already watching the transit center feeds through contacts in the city emergency services network and sat down in the only chair not covered in equipment. She did not bring a contract or a salary figure or a legal argument. She told him that she had spent 2 years thinking of Lifeline Grid as an asset requiring control and understood now it was a commitment requiring honoring, and that she had been wrong about the distance between those two things and about what it cost people when the people in charge of such systems made that particular mistake. Grant told her that he could activate equal light route and restore Elise's original configuration, but that doing so would expose the key's location and give Dorian a legal argument for seizure after the crisis passed, and that a verbal promise from a suspended CEO was not the kind of protection that Elise's principles could be built on. He told her that if she wanted him to activate the key, she needed to sign a legal commitment transferring Lifeline Grid's operational framework to the public benefit model before the key was used. Seraphina asked him for a pen. He found one under a stack of calibration reports. She signed the commitment document Camille had drafted 2 days earlier in anticipation of exactly this moment. Grant picked up the drive. Grant did not go into the transit center. He connected the drive to the independent control terminal he had built years earlier as part of Lifeline Grid's original architecture. A fail-safe node designed to reach the system from outside any corporate network, built specifically for the scenario in which the people controlling the infrastructure were simultaneously the people preventing correct emergency response. Adrian had left a narrow technical channel open when his credentials were revoked, a pathway that survived the lockout because it ran on a protocol layer predating Kingsley's ownership, and Grant used it to establish a connection without touching any of Kingsley's proprietary network infrastructure. Equal light route did not patch the active configuration. It replaced it, the way a key does not pick a lock but opens it. The priority ledger went offline in approximately 3 seconds. The backup generators redistributed power output according to the original algorithm. Electricity to the areas with the highest concentration of people in the highest degree of danger, with no reference to payment tier, organizational classification, or estimated legal exposure. The emergency exits in the maintenance concourse unlocked simultaneously. The elevator system cleared its priority hold and began routing cars to the lower levels, where the repair crew and cleaning staff had been standing in rising water for 11 minutes. The directional display panels throughout the facility updated to reflect the safest actual routes, without regard for which areas Kingsley's insurance model would have preferred to keep unoccupied. The city's emergency response crews had been unable to access the facility's system data for 20 minutes before Grant activated the key, because CrownShield had been running in a closed network mode that excluded public safety services from its information feed, consistent with the confidentiality provisions in the addenda Grant had declined to sign. Equal light route carried Elise's original public access protocol as a non-negotiable operating condition, and within 90 seconds of activation, the City Emergency Coordination Center received a live floor plan, real-time occupancy data, structural hazard alerts, and a complete routing recommendation for every team staged outside the building. No one inside the facility died. The 600 people present were guided out over the following 40 minutes, and the transit authority's subsequent after-action report noted the accuracy and speed of the evacuation guidance as exceptional. Dorian moved to the server room during the evacuation and attempted to delete the system's operational logs, which would have removed the documented record that CrownShield had locked the maintenance exits and slowed the alerts in the service sections before Equal Light Route corrected it. He did not know that Elise had built an immutability mechanism into the log architecture. Any attempt to alter or delete records of how the system had allocated emergencies resources triggered an automatic backup to a publicly accessible server that had been running continuously since Lifeline Grid's original deployment. The deletion attempt did not remove the logs. It published them. Camille had spent the previous 48 hours assembling the documentary record of Dorian's parallel activities, and what she had found extended beyond the priority ledger and the pre-filed lawsuit. He had entered into confidential agreements with several major insurance carriers, under which those companies would pay an ongoing fee to have CrownShield prioritize their insured assets and highest value policyholders during emergency events. Arrangements structured through the same intermediary network he had used to acquire Lifeline Grid's original corporate debt and never disclosed to Seraphina, to the full board, to any regulatory agency, or to any public body that had authorized the pilot program. Seraphina released the complete system logs and Camille's documentation to the relevant federal agencies and made the same materials available to the press covering the storm, accepting that this would cost the company a significant portion of its share value and trigger an immediate regulatory inquiry. Grant produced the original contract addenda during the resulting investigation and demonstrated that the priority ledger provisions bore Dorian's digital authorization signature, but had never received a valid signature from Seraphina. Camille confirmed under oath that the addenda had been embedded within several thousand pages of routine board documentation, in a way specifically designed to prevent the chief executive from identifying it as a material provision requiring personal review. Dorian's access credentials were revoked by end of day. He issued a statement alleging that Grant had exploited a natural disaster to illegally seize control of commercial technology. Grant's attorney provided the court with the trust documentation Elise had registered, the immutability logs Elise had built, and the evidence that Dorian had prepared his lawsuit before any event requiring one. The statement was not repeated after the trust documents entered the record. The aftermath of the Meridian Transit Center event produced a regulatory response that moved with unusual speed, partly because the documentary evidence was exceptionally clean, and partly because the agencies involved had been waiting for a specific basis to examine the privateering practices expanding quietly through commercial emergency infrastructure contracts across multiple states. Kingsley Dynamics faced a federal inquiry into its contract submission practices, civil litigation from institutional investors claiming material misrepresentation, and the termination of 3 major government partnerships it had been developing alongside the CrownShield program. The company's share price declined sharply through the first 2 weeks of coverage and stabilized at a level requiring the board to restructure its capital commitments for the following fiscal year. Seraphina held a public press conference in which she did not read from prepared remarks. She said plainly that Kingsley had attempted to commercialize emergency response technology using a tiered payment architecture, that Grant Holloway had refused $66,000 a month because the contract's addenda violated the foundational principles of the system's original design, that her company had filed a lawsuit accusing him of sabotage, that the evidence demonstrated he had not committed, and that the version of the system built and protected by Grant and Elise Holloway had been directly responsible for the successful evacuation of every person inside the Meridian Transit Center. She offered Grant a public apology without attaching conditions or requesting any particular response. The board attempted to void the public benefit commitment Seraphina had signed outside Grant's shop the night of the storm, arguing that the document had been executed during her period of formal suspension. Camille advised the board that the commitment was valid under the trust's independent legal standing regardless of the internal suspension order, and that any judicial challenge would require relitigating the circumstances under which the suspension itself had been authorized. The board declined to pursue it. Seraphina exercised her personal shareholder vote to ratify the commitment formally at the next board meeting, accepting that this action would likely trigger an effort to remove her from the chief executive role, and did it without equivocation. Grant was offered his original salary a second time, in a contract stripped of every addenda provision, every hidden clause, and every mechanism for transferring permanent control of Equal Light Route. He declined $66,000 a month for the second time, not because the terms were unacceptable, but because an employment arrangement placed him within the corporate structure that the trust had been designed to stand apart from, and a board that had suspended one executive under pressure could suspend him at precisely the moment requiring the kind of independent decision Elise had built into the architecture. Instead, he accepted the role of technical director at the Elise Holloway Public Safety Trust, the organization that held Equal Light Route under independent governance. The trust licensed the core platform to Kingsley Dynamics and other manufacturers at a cost recovery rate, while making the foundational software freely available to every public emergency service, municipal fire department, transit authority, and volunteer rescue organization that needed it. A portion of the licensing revenue was directed to training programs for emergency personnel, infrastructure upgrades in low-income residential areas, technical scholarships, and support funds for the families of first responders. Grant did not own a new vehicle or a larger workspace. He paid the overdue rent, settled the bank's correspondence about the house, and continued going to work each morning in the same converted warehouse on the south end of the city, where the bench had been repaired so many times it had become something new while remaining exactly what it had always been. Dorian Blackthorne's removal from Kingsley Dynamics preceded his formal indictment on charges of contract fraud, material misrepresentation to a federal regulatory body, and unauthorized modification of a certified safety system, the last charge carrying the most significant potential consequences, given that 600 people had been inside the Meridian Transit Center when the modifications were active. His legal team spent the better part of 2 years constructing arguments about the operational complexity of large infrastructure systems, but the immutability logs Elise had built made the core facts unusually difficult to contest. Seraphina retained the chief executive position under a governance restructuring that established an independent oversight board with authority to review any contract involving public safety systems and emergency response infrastructure, adding layers of accountability she had not previously operated under and supporting every provision of the restructuring without argument, which observers characterized variously as genuine transformation or the most effective strategic repositioning in the company's recent history, and which Seraphina herself declined to characterize as either. Kingsley's financial position stabilized into something smaller and less dramatic than the trajectory Dorian had been constructing, but more durable than the company had any right to expect, given the scope of the crisis it had survived. The contracts it lost were gradually replaced by a different category of partnership, municipalities and transit authorities that chose to work with Kingsley, specifically because the audit-accessible model the trust had established provided a level of verifiable accountability no other vendor in the space was offering. The margins were narrower and the processes considerably more visible, which turned out to be the version of the business that certain clients had been waiting for without knowing it existed. Grant's repair shop stopped receiving notices from the landlord. The Elise Holloway Public Safety Trust leased the warehouse for a community testing facility, a space where emergency equipment could be calibrated, protocols evaluated, and personnel from public rescue services trained without cost. And Grant continued working from the same bench he had used for 11 years, the work carrying now the additional layer of purpose that came from knowing the space served something beyond his own maintenance contracts. Willa received a scholarship through an independent technical design program with no connection to any arrangement involving Seraphina Kingsley, which mattered to Grant more than he said, and which Willa understood without needing it spoken. Seraphina came to the shop one afternoon without any business agenda and found herself looking at a photograph pinned to the wall above the component bins. Grant and Elise, on the day Lifeline Grid completed its first full operational test, both of them caught laughing at something outside the frame, the system monitors visible in the background with every indicator reading green. She asked Grant whether he thought Elise would have disliked her. Grant thought about it for a moment before answering. Elise had not built the system to decide who was a bad person. She had built it to make sure that, when everyone was most afraid, the right thing happened regardless of who was in the room and what they stood to gain or lose. Seraphina said that for a long time she had believed Grant's refusal came from pride. Grant said that was a reasonable thing to have believed. They stood in the shop for a while without either of them filling the silence, which was the first time that particular kind of quiet had been possible between them. 1 year after the Meridian Transit Center evacuation, Lifeline Grid was operational across dozens of transit stations, hospital networks, university campuses, and municipal emergency coordination centers throughout the region. Each installation carried a small notation in its technical documentation, a line Elise had written in the Trust's founding charter, and that Adrian had ensured appeared in every deployment protocol. In an emergency, no one is a second-tier customer. Grant led the Trust with the same temperament he brought to every piece of work, methodical, present, more interested in whether the system functioned correctly than in receiving credit for having built it. His income was stable. The house was his. He had no luxury vehicle, and no corporate office, and no particular interest in either, which had never been what the offer of $66,000 a month was actually about in the first place. Seraphina ran Kingsley Dynamics according to the model the restructuring had produced, and she was present at every independent audit of the Lifeline Grid installations alongside Grant, rather than receiving the results through a filtered summary from a subordinate. During the certification test for a new transit station on the northern edge of the city, every emergency exit opened in correct sequence on the first trial, not in the order of any financial classification, not in the direction of any preferred subscriber tier, simply outward and open, in the sequence most likely to help the most people facing the highest risk in the least amount of time. Seraphina asked Grant whether he had ever regretted refusing $66,000 a month. Grant looked at the notation on the system panel, Elise's name in the trust designation, still there, still legible, and said, "I did not refuse the money, I refused the price they attached to it." Seraphina extended a new partnership agreement across the console. It contained no exclusivity provisions, no hidden addenda, and no tier structure of any kind. Grant picked up the pen and signed it, and then the doors of the station opened at once before hundreds of people who carried no designation other than the one that had always mattered, present, and in need of a way out. No door opened earlier because of wealth. No door held closed because of rank. The promise Elise had asked Grant to keep was no longer held in one man's hands alone. It had become the principle an entire institution was now required to honor, and every door that opened proved it.